Karl Marx once said commodity fetish is the original sin of capitalism. Well, black capitalism is the original sin of sinners. I mix what I like, what I like, what I like, what I like, what I like. What's up, patrons and channel members? Thank you again for your support. To those who will see this whenever it's released more broadly, thanks to you as well, but please do reconsider your life choices. I'm not going to take a lot of time. I'm looking forward to the more to the discussions we're going to have forthcoming with the full review crew and others. Hopefully my hate crew will get involved as well. But just so I can get my first thoughts off my chest, technically, technologically, cinematically, in terms of a film, I'm sure it's great. It sounded great, looked great. I'm not so sure about some of the writing, some of the storytelling. Some of the reviews I've looked at were a little critical of how he uses the horror or engages the horror genre and all of that. I'm not really much for that or interested in that. One, I'm interested in that, again, much like I've said about these other films from Jordan Peele or Boots Riley, that if we're getting any substantive commentary or messaging, we're having to get it and sift through a bunch of violence and horror and jump scares and blood and gore to get it. So I to the extent that they're able to pull something off in that way, congratulations, but I don't think as a collective we should see that as some advance. And as it relates to Sinners, I see a lot of praise and recognition for Ryan Coogler now becoming the largest grossing black filmmaker in world history, and this film doing very well and being very well received, although in some cases not being properly reviewed or whatever, But again, and as he said himself, that is Coogler said himself, when asked about the special deal or the somewhat special deal he got in being able to recuperate ownership after 25 years of this film, unlike his other films, he said that his only motivation for assuring that deal was because of the importance of this particular story to him and his family history, being inspired by his uncle and his uncle's history here. But also, as he says, and what is the important theme that I hope people don't miss in this film, that the heroes, the protagonists, are again starting with the idea that black entrepreneurialism, black ownership, black business is the pathway to freedom. In fact, they say in the film, the one night that they had where they thought that they had the ownership of this business was as free as they got. And as you see, as is the case with black business, the surrounding white power policy structure has much more to say about the success of that business than anything having to do with black business acumen, circulation of dollars, which is again a mythological marketing concept and very unreal, or anything to do with that. It has everything to do with some, beyond. But again, to my point, that Coogler's individual success is doing exactly what the black capitalist mantra says it should do, which is William F. Buckley said, scatter some success to breed universal hope. So again, Coogler, very competent filmmaker, I'm not here to dispute any of that. I am here to point out that, as he says himself, and as the film says and demonstrates, we're all meant to have an affinity and a love for and an appreciation for the efforts of two black businessmen.
Message!
So as I've said to a couple friends and loved ones in some semi-ironic texts, Sinners is a blacker version of the classic Crossroads film, but with less discussion of the blues, and we are robbed of a classic guitar duel with the devil for one soul. And it's also a black business-centered addition to the vampire genre of films, whether Twilight took teen romance, white teen angst and romance, and put vampires on it and made billions of dollars. Here we have black capitalism entrepreneurialism with some allusions to important bits of Black history, thrown into the vampire genre, and with little more substance. For some of us, it's always cool to see Saul Williams pop up. It's cool to see Delroy Lindo pop up. It's cool to see some allusions, as a few reviews have pointed to Coogler talking about the struggles of race and mixture and who is in the Black community and the very real overlapping histories of Irish and Chinese immigrants and exploited labor, So there's all these potentially beautiful threads to pull on and talk about and to tell a story of, but we lose a lot of that, as a couple of reviews have pointed out themselves, to underneath this blood and gore and vampire thing. And at the end of the film, we get shout out to Buddy Guy. It's always good for those of us who know and appreciate blues and history. It's good to see Buddy Guy still, hanging on. And he himself was a former sharecropper and who left the fields to go up to Chicago and become a blues legend. So it's great to see him playing at the end of the film, and then the post-credit scene playing the grown young man. So salute to him. But in terms of some sort of groundbreaking representation of the history that brings us forward to some advance, I'm in fact, in one interview, Coogler says he leaves that to the audience. That, as I've pointed out for years now, and going back to his first film, Fruitvale Station, and all the praise it got there, there's all this discussion of how Coogler humanizes Black people, which is, again, code for teaching white people that Black people are human so that they'll go to see the film, which I've always been bothered by. And then we see in one interview where Coogler says that he, and as I've pointed out, as he's always been praised for, he can tell these very important Black stories and some histories without being too blunt or overt and overbearing with his discussion of race and racism. The same thing is said about this film. And then, as he said in his own interview, in one of his own interviews, he leaves it to the viewers to put certain pieces together. So all of that to say, what Coogler is doing is, and then one review said he's speaking at a certain register that if you're in the Black community and know, it'll speak to you. And if you're not, you just don't. But that is looked at uncritically. So all of that to say, Coogler has this very capable talent. He's very talented and capable, but he has this a unique, perhaps, skill in both telling stories of race and racism without being too blunt about it and offending white affluent moviegoers, which is the target audience you need if you want to become the biggest box office producing Black filmmaker in history. You're not getting that. You're not getting there from Black audiences alone. But you are going to require Black audiences to sign off on the authenticity. So that's why when he can speak at that register, he can speak to audiences. But then, as he says, the audiences have to fill in the gaps themselves. So he's not going to be overt in some sort of message guiding audiences anywhere. He's going to, because that would then threaten his career and his standing in Hollywood and his ability to make all these films and make a deal for himself with this film to retain ownership and then have us praise him for that, which is, again, a slick way of bringing us back to the Black capitalist ethic of scattered success breeds universal hope. So therefore, his scattered success should be our hope as well. But he's able to speak at a register that allows Black audiences to give the authenticity, because we project onto what we see he's doing without saying it, but then he's able to not say it so that he can attract the white and other audiences and not offend anyone and have this seminal, very unique career. I do also want to note that in a couple of these interviews, he's made references to foundational Black America. So I hope that he is not losing sight of the pan-Africanism he alludes to in the film, showing the continuity and even starting the film with a reference to the griot, which I was always cautioned against using in Africana studies. The French derived term about black people, Africans being storytellers, when, again, much like the zodiac, Greeks not know, or not, well, first of all, the zodiac, them not knowing, or the hieroglyphs as they called it, not knowing that they're looking at some deep and meaningful symbols and stories and mathematical, religious, and scientific symbols, reducing African to storytellers when it's so much the hala, as Dr. Bakari told us, to the Fulani term, I believe it is, to use, more speaks to the it's an African derived term. It speaks also more to the role and function of these folks in African societies. But I say all that to say I hope Coogler's not losing sight of that. And as he talked about in one of his interviews, his 86% West African DNA, by these repeated references to foundational Black America. Because remember, foundational Black America is enslaved, are enslaved and descendants of enslaved Africans, and part of an African continuity that neither begins nor ends with the enslavement here in the West. But to the point I'm getting at, with the undertone of the theme being Black entrepreneurialism, Black capitalism is freedom and liberation, albeit briefly because of the vampires, it would make sense that he would also refer and extend the very conservative, reactionary concept of foundational Black America. One last quick point. There was some consideration that his use of vampires was a symbol for the blood-sucking nature of white supremacy and hostility in the music industry as it relates to Black communities here in the U.S. and elsewhere. I was hoping, when he was asked about it, that he would have made reference to the very Malcolm X statement that when you see a capitalist, you see a bloodsucker. But of course, Coogler doesn't do that. He talks in his interviews about the importance of the vampire in U.S. and many others, popular cultures and imaginations, and that at most, he said, it was also so symbolic of the relationship that the white business community has, or the white music industry has, to Black culture, business, and cultural production. But again, as he said, his primary goal with retaining ownership of the film after 25 years was to point to the importance of Black ownership, not specifically to the shortcomings of capitalism and therefore Black capitalism as a solution to the problem, and not as a reference to the ongoing colonial extraction, unless it's something that we're supposed to put together, as he said, on our own, which again, unfortunately leads me back to one of my other previous points, and why the Vernon philosophy is so important, that if we're asked to project everything and fill in the gaps, this is well understood in media studies, that those filling in those gaps are filled in with the presets we are set up with and have imposed on us from the beginning. So often what we fill in gaps with are the same illogic, or come from the same illogic of that caused those gaps in the first place. So that's why it is important that we have more direct forms of communicating radical, critical, revolutionary messages, and that, as Mtume has said, we learn as audiences to see a different kind of film, because we're never going to have IMAX capable, funded and supported revolutionary material to look at. And yet people, as was the case even in my little bougie, suburban, mostly Black theater audience, were praising the shooting, the killing of hillbillies. There was that cathartic, yay, when the shooting, But that's just Coogler speaking to us at a register, letting us fill in the gaps. Killing rednecks and hillbillies is an old Hollywood trope. It's not a radical or elevated analysis. Doesn't necessarily take us anywhere. But all right, but again, much more to come. Review crew and others will get on this. Much more to say about this. Just wanted to get this off my chest and out. And thanks again for your support. Peace only if you're willing to fight for it. Catch you next time right here at
I mix what I like, what I like, what I like, what I like, what I like.